Okay, sewing friends, I want to get started here with showing you how to create the two-tone tote and take you through the basic steps for it. Some of the steps I'll have already finalized, but let's get the basics down here so that you can hopefully read from the PDF file and then be able to follow along with the video. Okay, so I've showed you a picture of all of the pieces and parts, and the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and sew the strap. So I've got a 3" by 22" piece. I'm going to fold it right sides together, and I'm going to sew along the raw edge with a 1/4" seam allowance. So I've got my machine set currently on just a standard straight stitch, and what I've actually done is change the needle position, or left-right shift as it's called on some machines, to 5.5. And when you use the standard presser foot on pretty much all the machines that I've ever sewed on, but certainly on the Brother machines, which many of you know I'm a Brother ambassador. On the Brother machines, when we have that needle position or left-right shift set for 5.5, from the edge of presser foot J to the needle position is just about a perfect 1/4". Yes, if I were doing quilting, patchwork where I need real accuracy, I'm going to go ahead and switch to a true 1/4" foot for that. But for just a basic 1/4", this works really, really well. Okay, so I've sewn the first strap. Obviously, I would sew the second one the exact same way. And the next step in the instructions actually tells you to take your interfacing strip, and I've just cut a little itty-bitty piece here to show you as an example what you would do. The fusible interfacing is cut at a width of 1 1/8 inch, and that measurement is so that you can lay that strip down directly between the fold of the fabric and the seam line, and just kind of, you know, center it in the middle. It's only designed to fill that area so that you get a little bit of stiffening and a little bit more body to the straps. Remember, we're working with quilt weight cotton, and that is you know, a rather soft fabric, but again, because it's going to be lined, it's going to really give it a good feel and a good body. So the next step would be to go ahead and go to your iron and fuse that interfacing into place. And by the way, I have selected an interfacing that is commonly used for shirt collars and cuffs. I use the Pellon brand Sheer Tailor, SHIR-TAILOR, for lots and lots and lots of my projects when I need a kind of a mid-weight interfacing that's fusible and is going to add a pretty good amount of firmness without being too overly stiff. All right, let me go ahead and show you. I've already done that to my remaining strap here, and actually I got to go ahead and sew one more. So let me pause you for a minute. I'll be back with another strap. All right, so you can see I have both straps sewn here, and now it's time to turn them right side out. And yes, there are tools for that, and actually I have a nifty little dandy tool somewhere for turning these types of things right side out, but I don't know where it's at. So we're just going to use a safety pin today, and I've got a good size safety pin. It just gives you something to hook onto the fabric and then begin to push through, and then you want to pull the fabric over the pin as you're pushing it through. Make sure you don't get too much fabric on there at one time, because if you do, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to grab that and pull that. It's going to get a little bit stuck, and this is a little bit of a tedious job, but it's not too bad. And actually, it's easier. I will tell you, it's easier if you have a way to dampen your fingers. So maybe have a little a finger bowl of water or a little sponge or a wet washcloth, or head over and do this near a sink where you can just dampen your fingers a little bit so you can get that pulled through. It just helps give you a little bit of grip. If you have a little bit of fingernail tip, that helps too. Unfortunately, my fingernails are always pretty much on the shorter side. But you can see as you go along, it starts to get easier. Just pinch that end, pull it over, and remember you want to do this just a little bit at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and pause again, and we'll be back with some strap. And I want to show you this part. Once you've got that pin part pulled out from the end there, then you can go ahead, you can unpin that safety pin, and now you can just grab on the fabric and roll that up until you've got your whole tube turned right side out. Okay, so at this point you want to go and give this a really good press on the iron, and because we sewed that one seam in that position with the interfacing laying between the two, you know, the fold and the seam, you want to make sure and press that so that that seam is rolled right on the edge of that strap strip, because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to top stitch on either side of this and give that a little bit of a decorative look and also help hold those edges in place. Of course, I would go ahead and trim that little extra bit of interfacing off there. So I'll be back as soon as I get this all ironed up for you. I am back with my strap sample here to show you, all pressed and ready to top stitch. And while I was at the iron, I went ahead and took my piece, which is optional in the instructions, for creating a tab for a closure, and I fused the interfacing on the wrong side of that 3-inch wide by 5-inch long piece. And you'll notice that I just went ahead and fused a piece of interfacing on the whole piece here. I'm not going to really worry about it being in the seam allowances, and having it in both ends of the tab that will end up being folded and have a buttonhole there is going to give that some nice stability for that closure. Okay, it looks like my needle came out of my thread came out of the needle. Let me go ahead and fix that real quick. We all love these automatic needle threaders. I'm sewing on the Brother Luminaire machine today, but this tote bag only requires a straight stitch and an optional buttonhole if you want to add that tab, so there is nothing you need to have that's fancy in order to create this. So my next step then, again, is going to be to top stitch this, and I'm going to use that same edge guide and the same needle position to give me a 1/4 inch top stitch from the edge. Whenever I top stitch, I pretty much always increase my stitch length, so I'm going to go up to 3.5 for length on this, and that's going to do a couple things for me. Number one, I'm going to go ahead and back stitch here so that doesn't come out. It's going to just give a little bit of a more prominent look to the stitch. The stitches don't tend to get buried in the fabric when it's a little bit longer, and normally this would also allow you to do this step a little bit faster if you like. I'm a pretty methodically slow stitcher, but especially when I'm on camera and I'm trying to show this and stay out of the way and keep my hands in a position where you can still see this. So let's go all the way down to the end, and then there's a couple ways we could take that out and we could start over again, but since that end is going to be buried in a seam allowance, I'm just going to go ahead and pivot around, start back over until I get myself lined up. Doesn't matter where that ends, because I'm just going to go ahead and raise the presser foot, raise the needle, and get myself lined back up for that second line of 1/4 inch stitching. This one I'll do just a little bit faster. Yeah, I usually keep my speed dial right about in the middle, and then I'm using, of course, my foot control, and the more pressure I put on, the faster I go. The less pressure I put, the slower I go. Go ahead and back stitch at the end there, and we'll give that a little cut. And I'm actually using a feature on this machine that tells the machine when I want to start sewing to go ahead and lower the presser foot, and when I want to stop sewing, it'll automatically come up. So there you go. I've got some really pretty top stitching on there. Doesn't matter what color thread you want to use. You can use something that's going to just kind of blend with your fabric, or use something that has a little bit of contrast. So I've got a set of straps already finished here. You can see I actually used a different color there. And like I said, they just have a really nice firm feel. I do realize there are lots of other ways to sew straps, and the reason I picked this particular method is I wanted to keep all of the measurements relatively easy, so that when we're doing this, we don't have a lot of varying measurements in the whole scheme of things. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and sew my tab now while I'm at it, and I'm just going to take that 5-inch long piece, fold it in half lengthwise, and I'm going to sew these two short edges. You can see I just lowered my presser foot, and that told my machine to go ahead and start sewing. And we'll do that back stitch. Same thing at this end. And then I'll just whip around here and do the other side. So again, the tab is totally optional. It just allows you to put a button on one side and then use the tab with the buttonhole to close up the top of that tote. All right, so that one is done. I'm going to go ahead and we'll trim these corners. And I'll do that by just cutting a little angle to the point there. And then we want to turn that right side out. That is easy. I usually like to use a chopstick to poke out those little corners. I think I'll press this, and when I get to the iron, I'll fix that up there. So, all right, we are going to move on to the next step, and we'll polish this one up in a little bit. So the next step is to go ahead and, oh, actually, let me back up here. I'm going to need to go ahead and go to the iron and get this poked out, and then get that both sides top stitch, because that is going to be an integral part of my next step. So I'll be right back with you. All right, I'm back with my tab all pressed, and I did bring my little chopstick just to show you. That's what I usually use to poke out corners, push them, and get those points pulled out. Sometimes I will take a pin if it gets a little bit stubborn and just put the tip of the pin in there and kind of give a little pull with that. Either a good strong pin, straight pin, or sometimes I'll even use a strong needle for that. I know there's lots of other gizmos and gadgets, but the nice thing about a chopstick is if it gets you know, misplaced, set aside in the sewing room, buried, you know what I mean, it's not a big deal to just get another one. Alrighty, so we're going to go ahead and top stitch this now. Again, I'm just going to back stitch that a little bit. And I'll pivot around there. Make a nice tab. And you've probably already noticed, okay, I'm using two different fabrics here, obviously. And they do happen to coordinate. They were from a collection of coordinating prints. But this is the perfect project for you to just go ahead and use, you know, whatever you have on hand. Even if you have fat quarters and you've got 4 different ones, you could, you know, if they look pretty together, you could use that for your inside, outside, right side, you know, and just use 4 different pieces all the way around. We're now adding the straps and the optional tab to the top edges. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my what I'm going to have for my outside fabric, and it really doesn't matter what you pick, but I'm going to go ahead and pick this contrast fabric here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fold it with those top edges. Again, top is kind of a, loosey-goosey term. If your fabric has a one-way print, you definitely have a top. If it doesn't, then it really doesn't matter because this is cut, equally. But make sure you do take care to use the shorter side, because you have a longer side. It's the length of your tote bag, and then the shorter side are all of your top and bottom edges. So once I've done that, now it's just a really easy way to line things up. I'm going to take my 6-inch seam gauge, and I'm going to line up the halfway mark right there on center point mark there. Grab some pins, and that's what I'm going to use for positioning for my strap. So I'll just put one end of the strap at the outer edge of that 6-inch seam gauge. Go ahead and pin that in place. And then I'm going to take the other end. I'm going to swoop this around. Make sure this doesn't get tangled up. You want to make sure that the same side is facing up here as it is here. And just put that strap to the other end of the bag. And we'll pin that in place. And then while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and position the tab right there in the center as well. So I'll just line up the center of that tab with that center pin, and we'll pin that in place. Okay, I'm going to make the buttonhole on the tab before I go ahead and insert it on the other side between the inside and outside piece of the tote bag. So let me talk just for a minute about buttonhole feet. Brother machines, generally you're going to find two different styles, and what we have here is the standard style where the buttonhole goes into the little slider in the back. You just slide it open, slide it closed until it's tight, and you can see that the distance between this tab here and this tab here will equal what you need for that button. In this particular case, we would have a buttonhole lever that would pull down from the back area of the machine right around here, and then we would snap that foot on and select our buttonhole, and it would automatically stitch the entire buttonhole from start to finish and make it the perfect length for your button. And then the second style is the one that I have for the Brother Luminaire. This one actually includes an additional plate that helps you level out fabric that may have a little bit of a shifting surface, but I'm going to be working on a flat piece, so I removed that extra addition there. So take a look at both of these. Actually, I wanted to point out that you've got guideline markers there. You've got a red line for the center of your buttonhole, and then two red lines, one on the left, one on the right, to help you position the starting point for your buttonhole. So I'm going to go ahead and snap this on. I'll tell you a little bit more about that when I get it on there. And the difference obviously with this one, this is going to actually use the camera function on the Luminaire, and you can see it automatically brightened up my lights. It needs the light for the camera, so it will automatically do that. I'm going to send the needle down and then up. I'm going to raise my presser foot, just use my little seam gauge here to sweep that thread underneath. That'll make it just a little bit neater. I've selected a rounded end buttonhole. That's my favorite buttonhole. It's round on both the beginning and the ending end, and it just makes a nice, neat buttonhole. For marking a buttonhole, hopefully you can see I have marked what looks like a T shape, and I've got a pin in there so that you can see that horizontal line, and then you can see my vertical line is right there in the center. And I always extend that vertical line so that it's longer than I need. You'll see now I'm going to go ahead and line this up, and that vertical center line helps me line up right there with the center line here on my foot, and I can just slide that into position. And I might have to lower the presser foot and raise it a few times to get that on target there, but I want you to see that the red line here isn't actually the precise starting point. That's just a guideline for you. So what I usually do is create that marking. Like I said, I put the pin in there just so you could see it a little bit better, and then align that, and your lines here are just going to be just slightly forward of that. So this can vary a lot depending on what kind of markers you use, how thick your line is drawn. The main thing is each and every time you start a new buttonhole, if you have continuous buttonholes, you want to be consistent at that starting point. So if you're using, that targeting right in line with those red lines, fine, you can do that, but it's going to sew just a little bit farther forward, and you would want to do that on each and every one. I'm going to use that just slightly backwards, so my red lines are actually positioned just beyond where I've drawn that line for my starting point. I'm going to go ahead and pull that pin out, and you can see here that I've got straight lines on the side of my throat plate. That'll also help me keep that tab straight. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the foot control for this, but as I'm doing it, I want to tell you just a few things. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing that. First of all, I will tell you that it does do a little bit of a different speed. It'll speed up and it'll slow down, and that's just whatever. It's got a mind of its own on that. I do want to caution you though that as you're doing this, do not raise your presser foot, because if you do, it's going to throw the whole buttonhole off. You want to do this in one continuous motion. This would be a good time if you wanted to, where you could unplug your foot control and simply use the start-stop button, your button here on the machine, and let it go automatically that way. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and cut that thread, raise the presser foot, and voila, you see there I have a beautiful, beautiful buttonhole. Let me go ahead and zoom that in a little bit so you can see that really good there. Okay, snap this off. And I've also got another sample here that I've already completed with a buttonhole, and I want to explain to you what I did there. A little later on, we're going to be creating boxed corners on this tote. And when you do boxed corners, we're going to end up cutting a squared off section from the bottom pieces. And when you do that, you're going to end up with a piece that looks like this. It's going to have a seam in the middle. And if you wanted to, you could use this to make your tab. So you would just simply fuse interfacing on there like I suggested for the regular tab. You would fold this in half with the seam right at the bottom there, match those short raw edges, sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side, turn it right side out like we did the other tab, and top stitch it, and you would end up with a tab like this. So essentially it is just about the same size and same shape as my tab that I constructed from the 3-inch wide by 5-inch piece. So if you want to be a little economical, you can go ahead and use this little extra scrap that you have left over. You're going to have pieces of this from both your inside and outside piece of your tote. All right, we are ready now to go ahead and get that tab sandwiched in with the strap. So I'm going to pause for a minute and I'm going to go ahead and do that process. So I started to say before that I was going to tell you a little bit more. This tote, if you've read the instructions already or you read the story a little bit about it, was developed so that we could have a sewing party basically and create totes to donate to a local family crisis center. So I had been showing totes in my local club meeting that I teach once a month, and showing just a variety of different decorative techniques and embroidery designs. So we just had a tote theme going on for a few months, and then I just kind of had a brainstorm and thought, well, why don't we figure out a good way to make use of a lot of the different things we've learned about totes and create one and find a good purpose for it. So I did some research and found a family crisis center in the local area here, and we went ahead and had a sewing party day and made totes. And then my friends from club and other friends from the local dealership pitched in, and we ended up with, I think, 68 total totes that were donated recently, and the recipients for those were really, really thrilled. Okay, so I've got both of these done. Now, it was important that I did that step because the next step is going to be to take my lining piece, and from here on out I've just determined that this particular print is going to be my outer fabric, my outside fabric. So I'm taking now my lining piece, I'm going to put right sides together, raw edges matching, and yes, I am a pinning person. I am not shy about using pins. Don't really have to on some of these things, especially with cotton. They tend to stick. They tend to stick together before you stitch them. But I don't know. I just like that little extra control that I have when I have those edges all pinned. So we're going to go ahead and sew these top seams next. Okay, so I've got my first one pinned and ready to go. And in this particular case, we are now going to switch to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to move this over. I'm going to go to the center needle position on my machine and follow then along my 1/2 inch line here, and that's going to give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And again, this isn't really critical, but we want a little bit more seam allowance here at the top because we're going to need to have a little extra to catch that seam allowance in and do a top stitch along there when we finalize this, so that we've got a little bit more strength. Now, I am a big fan of pinning, but I am not a big fan of sewing over pins, so make sure you get those pins out of there before you stitch across it. And if you find it easier to just find a needle position that gives you a 1/2 inch from the edge of your presser foot, I'm looking at this now and I probably could have done that a little bit easier that way. I think I'm off a little bit. I'll be better on the next one. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and go over this seam so that I'm sure I have a 1/2 inch there. Yeah, see, I'm a little shy there, so let me go ahead and re-sew this seam. This time I'm going to be a little bit more careful. Okay, there's my, I think I've discovered if I move my needle to the left, so play along with me here, get a new setting there, and I think I determined that if I have my needle on the far left and I have my presser foot edge along the raw edge of the fabric, I'm going to get just about a perfect 1/2 inch. So again, this, I just want to be consistent because each one of these seams on top, in order to match properly, is going to have to be consistent. So I know I was a little skinny on there. I'm going to go ahead and do that seam over again. And we'll speed this up just a little bit. And if you feel more comfortable basting those straps and the tab in place before you sew this seam, go right ahead. That's not a bad idea to do that. Just run a machine line of basting stitches right across there so that they don't wiggle out of the way at all. Okay, back stitch, give that a cut. All right, so you can see when I open this up that my straps are trapped in there And we'll go ahead and grab that second one that has my tab in it. All right, so this time I'm going to be much more particular. I'm going to line that right up with the raw edge. Start with a little back stitch. Check underneath there, make sure that's smooth. Get my pins out of there. So again, this does make a great charity project if you can find a place that has a need for something like this. You know, what we were thinking is that a lot of times these families have to, you know, leave their homes or move places rather quickly. They're not always prepared with suitcases and all the things that we maybe take for granted. And even just for, you know, normal storage of their personal items, it's really nice to have an attractive bag for them to use. So in the project that we did several with all different kinds of prints and colors that both adults would like, and then we also made some for children. And we also made some that were a little bit on the smaller side for children. They're great for carrying books, like I said, just all kinds of things. All right, so I have got these now all ready for pressing. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to pause and go to my iron. I'll be back.